There are archives that seem to freeze time, not because of their official importance, but because of the strange silence they leave around them. The case of the Winterpine family's frozen attic is one such archive. Discreet, rarely mentioned in state reports, almost forgotten in yellowed newspapers, and yet as insistent as a cold wind that returns every winter through the same crack in the window. The researcher who, decades later, would reconstruct the story called that set of papers the coldest dossier I have ever encountered. Not because of the climate of northern Michigan, where everything happened in 1899, but because of the feeling of incompleteness that pervades every page. In the few preserved documents, one number repeats itself obstinately: 53 travelers. It is their collective trail that inevitably leads to the Winterpine attic. At the end of the 19th century, the small community of North Ashridge, lost among tall pine trees, half-frozen lakes, and dirt roads that turned to mud when the thaw came, lived off the hard work of lumberjacks and the irregular traffic of wagons connecting distant villages. It was a place of simple names, quiet voices, and strict habits. People knew more than they said, commented less than they saw, and learned early on not to ask questions that could not be answered eye to eye. The Winterpine family fit perfectly into this scenario of disciplined silence. They were not rich, but they were far from the poverty that marked most of the Finnish and Polish immigrants in the region. The patriarch, Elias Winterpine, was a tall, broad-shouldered, middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard and a restrained gait, as if measuring each step on a thin sheet of ice. His wife, Marta, ran the house as if it were a small military establishment. Schedules, stocks, reserves, everything noted down with precision. They had 3 adult children who still lived under the same roof, 2 boys and a daughter, and a younger nephew of nebulous origin who appeared in baptism records but was hardly mentioned in later testimonies. The Winterpine house was set back from the center of the village, atop a mound of earth that in winter looked like a white island surrounded by fields of trampled snow and narrow tracks marked by sleds. It was a dark wooden structure with a steep roof and a chimney that almost never rested. From the main road little could be seen: the rigid alignment of the windows, the simple porch, the barn in the background, and above all the outline of the attic, a strip of wood under the roof with small square openings like narrow eyes watching the road. At the end of the century, the Winterpine clan had become a silent reference point for travelers passing through the region. It was not exactly an official inn, with a sign or established rates, but a safe house where one could get a bed, hot soup, and a little warmth from the stove on excessively cold nights. The term clan, incidentally, does not appear in documents from that time. It appears later in oral accounts, letters, and late testimonies, as if the surname had expanded to embrace any distant relative or relative who came to live and work under that roof. Records from Huron County in northern Michigan show that the family regularly paid their taxes, contributed wood for public repairs, and occasionally provided supplies to the small local church. At first glance, nothing in these records suggests any kind of eccentricity. No formal complaints, no lawsuits, no recorded conflicts with neighbors. Just the stubborn streak of a family that survived the winter year after year, opening their doors to strangers when many preferred to lock them. But this is exactly where the story begins to stray from normality. The travelers who stayed at the house were mostly woodcutters in transit, peddlers, messengers traveling long distances, small traders with carts loaded with modest goods, fabrics, tools, kitchen utensils, medicines. Some stayed only one night, others 2 or 3, depending on snowstorms and road conditions. The local reverend's notes vaguely mention the Winterpine family's generous custom of welcoming weary travelers in times of great cold. One of the rare official testimonies from a surviving guest, recorded many years later in 1921, describes the house as warm, organized, but strangely quiet for a place with so many people passing through. The man recalls a long table, chairs lined up, a stove always lit, and above them, the muffled sound of footsteps in the attic, as if someone were dragging boxes, firewood, or light furniture across the wooden floor. At the time, he didn't think much of it. In big houses, there are always more people than we see, the researcher noted when transcribing the testimony. The attic, in fact, appears early in the descriptions, always shrouded in a kind of respectful distance. Some residents said that the family used it to store winter supplies. Others said it was a storage space for tools, clothes, and objects left behind by travelers who never returned to retrieve their belongings. None of these versions was particularly strange in a village accustomed to the instability of routes and the disappearance of passing figures. Men who arrived, worked for a few months, and moved on without a trace. What makes the Winterpine attic different is that in 1899 it began to be mentioned not only as a place where things were stored, but as the last common point in the trajectory of 53 people who crossed North Ashridge in a short period of time, and were never officially located again. The researcher found the first clue to this number in a notebook from the local Methodist church, where a deacon recorded donations, debts, and prayer requests with almost obsessive zeal. Among the pages referring to the end of 1898 and the year 1899, there are a series of entries that catch the eye. Men in transit staying at the home of Elias Winterpine. Travelers with no known family resting under the Winterpine roof. Small caravans mentioning the heated attic of the Winterpine house. None of this, taken in isolation, would be surprising. The region was a transit route. Winters were harsh. Large houses offered space. The anomaly appears when the researcher cross-references these small notes with another type of document. The toll and passage records kept by an old toll booth at the northern exit of the village, through which every wagon or sleigh had to pass when leaving North Ashridge for the more distant lumber mills. In the thick book, stained with melted snow and finger grease, the names of some travelers appear carefully noted in the entry into the region column. Dates, description of the wagon, number of animals, in some cases even the approximate destination. However, the column corresponding to departure, which should indicate when that same traveler left the village, remains blank for a specific list of 53 entries. Instead of the departure date, the space is empty, as if the ink had been saved for a filling that never occurred. It is at this point that the word Winterpine first appears in association with these same people. In a side note, written in the margin in smaller, more hurried handwriting, someone added, "All of these spent at least one night at the home of Elias Winterpine. See attached list." The attached list, in turn, was only found years later, attached with a rusty wire to the back cover of a county binder. On it are listed one below the other the first names of 53 travelers, with small pencil marks indicating the approximate date on which they passed through the Winterpine family's heated attic. There is no clear mention of what happened next. There are no departure dates. There are no toll receipts. Only that expression repeated as if it were a trivial detail of lodging. Passed through the heated attic, appearing next to each of the 53 names, which from there disappear from the paper and from the official memory of the region. Upon reaching this page, the researcher wrote a short note in the footer of his own notebook. The archives seem to agree on one thing. 53 travelers crossed North Ashridge in 1899, all of them touched, in some way, the Winterpine attic, and no subsequent record brings them back to the road. It was the first step on a staircase that would slowly lead into the frost attic, the frozen attic, and to the exact point where these men's trail ends, like footprints suddenly erased by a snowstorm that no one, to this day, has been able to fully explain. It is curious to observe how the daily life of an isolated community, seen from afar, seems as still as an old photograph. But when examined closely, it reveals small tensions, restrained gestures, and habits that silently shape the destiny of all who pass through there. In North Ashridge, in the winter of 1899, this apparent immobility was maintained by a precise cycle of work, prayer, silence, and survival in the cold. Life repeated itself with such constancy that any deviation, however small, took on the weight of an anomaly. The researcher describes this period with the same caution as a painting restorer. Note by note, crack by crack, he tries to recover how the Winterpines lived before the 53 travelers crossed their path. The family woke up early, before the pale light touched the pine trees, to light the iron stove, feed the animals in the barn, and divide up tasks that never changed. Elias took care of the wood and supervised the young woodcutters who sought temporary shelter in the village. Martha, always methodical, controlled food stocks as if guarding a safe. The children alternated their days between cutting trees, repairing sleds, and long walks to distant neighbors to exchange supplies. There are no reports of public fights, addictions, debts, or any event that would mark the family as suspicious. On the contrary, later testimonies describe them as respected, proper, composed, words chosen with the care of those who do not wish to exaggerate, but also do not want to leave gaps. Still, certain observations in the testimonies indicate that something about the Winterpines seemed out of place. Not strange, not threatening, just out of place, like a slightly misaligned part in a machine that continues to function. One such observation appears in a letter preserved by the descendants of a former reverend. "It is a house where no one ever laughs loudly," wrote the pastor. "There is no inappropriate joy nor obvious sadness. There is only an order that does not hurt, but lightly touches the spine." Another note from a traveling merchant who dined there in 1897 mentions that the Winterpines looked more at their hands than at the faces of their visitors, a habit he attributed at the time to a shyness common in families of Finnish origin. However, these signs, so subtle that they would hardly seem noteworthy, reappear in several scattered reports. The more the researcher aligned these fragments, the more it seemed to him that the family operated under an almost military internal discipline, where each member knew their role and rarely deviated from it. If there were arguments, they were muffled by the thick walls. If there were secrets, they were hidden in layers as old as the logs that supported the house. Travelers passing through described a proper atmosphere, welcoming to the right degree, but without excessive hospitality. Hot soup was always ready, the table was always set, the beds were always made. Nothing was improvised, nothing seemed out of place, except perhaps the almost total absence of adornments. In the Winterpine home, there were no photographs on the walls, no knickknacks, no family mementos, only wood, alignment, function, as if everything there were temporary, ready to be dismantled at any moment. The youngest nephew, mentioned in baptism records but rarely cited in testimonies, emerges as the most difficult presence to reconstruct. Some say he was taciturn, others say he possessed unusual intelligence. Some report that he worked mainly in the attic, organizing tools and boxes, and rarely came down to talk to visitors. His name appears only twice in the documents examined by the researcher, and always in connection with the storage of supplies during the colder months. It is impossible to say what role he played in the story that would follow, but his subsequent absence from the region's records raises in itself a discrete kind of shadow. The days before the traveler's disappearance unfold in the archives like slow scenes from a silent film. Intermittent storms brought heavy snow, covering trails and forcing many itinerant workers to stay longer than they had planned in North Ashridge. The lumber mills to the north were operating at full capacity, sending messengers to warn of delays and request reinforcements. It was precisely this unstable flow that brought weary travelers to the Winterpine's door, attracted by the reputation of hot soup, a firm roof, and, above all, an environment that seemed to promise safety. But according to some later accounts, something had begun to change in the house at the beginning of that winter. Small changes, almost imperceptible, but which ended up being recorded in the notebooks of two neighboring families. In one of them, a woman mentions that when she took butter to Martha Winterpine, she found the house colder than usual, as if the fire had been put out too early. In another, a 17-year-old boy writes that while passing by the road at dusk, he saw two of Elias's sons walking toward the barn carrying heavy sacks, and that, when he greeted them, he received only a quick nod, without words. There are also reports that, for 2 consecutive weeks, the light in the attic remained on until well after midnight. In a village where everyone went to bed early, this contrasted with the family's strict habits. Some speculated that they were reorganizing supplies for the harsh winter. Others, that they were receiving an unusual number of travelers and needed extra space. None of this, taken alone, was considered alarming. North Ashridge was accustomed to surviving its own shadows. But the researcher finds, among the testimonies, a phrase that seems to cross the years with a discreet impact. It was said by a young woman who, at the time, went to the Winterpine's house to help Martha with sewing and washing clothes. Years later, now elderly, she recalled a feeling she couldn't explain at the time. It was as if the house was full of people I couldn't see. She did not mention voices, noises, or footsteps, just a vague impression of silent occupation, of reduced space, as if the air were being shared with more people than were present before her. A feeling that at the time she attributed to the intense cold and the accumulation of work. Today this phrase appears as an emotional trace of something that had not yet emerged from the records. The researcher closes the context section with an observation that seems more like a warning. Before the disappearances were noticed, the Winterpine house was already showing signs that something had changed in it. Subtle signs, shrouded in snow, silence, and long nights of light in the attic. And it is precisely at this point that the chronologies begin to converge. The travelers arrive. The cold intensifies. The attic remains lit. And in a few days, the list of 53 names would begin to take shape, without anyone in the village realizing that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most silent and disturbing stories of their time. Reconstructing the exact chronology of the disappearances is a task that requires patience, meticulous cross-referencing of records, and above all, caution in the face of the gaps that inevitably arise. The researcher responsible for reconstructing the case acknowledges that much of what is known comes from incomplete documents, belated memories, and notes that seem more like rants than formal reports. Still, there is a possible timeline, fragile but consistent, indicating how the 53 travelers passed through North Ashridge and somehow touched the Winterpine's frost attic before disappearing. The first to be mentioned in the records is a traveling salesman named Harlan Dodge, in his 30s, who was traveling alone with a small wagon loaded with tools and lanterns. He appears in the toll booth logbook on January 3, 1899. He never appears in the exit column. The same gap occurs with two other woodcutters, brothers according to a note found among loose papers at the Pineford Mill lumberyard, who stayed overnight at the Winterpine's house on the night of January 5th. In the late statements, there is only one short sentence about them. They were too tired to talk. The researcher notes that although the disappearances seem sudden when viewed together, at the time no one noticed anything unusual. Travelers followed uncertain routes, worked unpredictable shifts, and changed course as opportunities arose. It was common for a man to leave the village saying he was heading east, and then, 2 weeks later, be seen working in the north. The lack of news was no cause for immediate alarm, and it is precisely this normality that, ironically, allowed the list of missing persons to grow without attracting attention. However, as winter progressed, small reports emerged, so discreet that they were almost not preserved. In a letter sent by a Methodist pastor to a colleague in Petoskey, there is a single line. "Travelers are staying longer than usual at the Winterpine house. I noticed faces I had never seen before leaving the property." The letter is from February. If he saw new faces leaving, why don't they appear in the toll booth exit records? Or was he confused in the dim light of late afternoon? These are questions that researchers cannot answer. The tension mounts as the reports converge on the same point in the house, the attic, the frost attic, whose existence had seemed mundane until then. A veteran woodcutter, survivor, and one of the last witnesses to see some of the travelers, stated in a late testimony that when he arrived to ask for shelter on a windy night, he heard muffled sounds coming from above. Not the sounds of boxes or tools, but something he described as short, restrained breaths, as if several people were trying to remain silent. He thought the family had taken in a very large group that night. And indeed, according to church records, the Winterpines had distributed more supplies than usual that week. But nothing explained why so many men, supposedly lodged there, did not appear at the dinner table or in the village's morning routines. At the end of February, The records become clearer, not because the authorities were vigilant, but because a series of intense storms forced several travelers to stay longer in the village. The Winterpine home became a constant refuge. Witnesses described the property as always busy, footprints in the snow, sleds tied up, lights on late into the night. Marta Winterpine was seen going to the barn with unusual frequency, carrying fresh supplies and returning with full bags. Her children, previously discreet, began organizing boxes and wood at unlikely times, dawn, early morning, and quiet intervals between storms. But what really caught the researchers' attention was a set of testimonies that, although fragmented, seemed to point to the same night, March 12, 1899, a date that never appeared in official reports, but which appears repeatedly in the late memories of the oldest inhabitants of North Ashridge. Most of them described the same feeling. The village seemed strangely quiet, even by the usual standards of winter. The wind blew irregularly, the snow fell in large, slow flakes, and a heavy fog hung over the roads, blurring contours and distances. That night, according to reports, the Winterpine house was fully lit, windows, kitchen, side hallway, and, unusually, the attic. The yellowish light leaking through the small square openings caught the attention of even those passing by on the road at a safe distance. A young man returning from the lumber yard reported decades later that the light seemed to pulsate, as if many people were moving around inside. At 8 o'clock in the evening, according to estimates based on testimony, a large wagon arrived at the property, pulled by 2 exhausted horses. 3 men got out, men who are on the list of 53 names and who would never be found again. A neighbor, watching from a distance, said they were carrying heavy backpacks and that one of them was limping slightly. The Winterpine family welcomed them at the door, but according to the same neighbor, no one seemed to exchange words. Only brief gestures, as if it were part of an established routine. There are no records of what happened in the following hours. The researcher found only possible reconstructions. The house remained lit until almost 3 in the morning. Footsteps were heard in the side hallway. The wind blew snow against the walls, muffling noises. In the attic, according to 3 independent witnesses, someone's shadow moved from side to side, slowly, deliberately, as if it had a continuous task to perform. It was also on that night that reports emerged of a line of men entering through the back door of the house. Not an organized line, but a sequence of figures that, seen from a distance, seemed protected by the darkness between the barn and the kitchen. An elderly woman who lived on a nearby property described seeing dark shapes, one after another, approaching the side entrance. She could not say whether there were 5, 10, or 20, only that they moved cautiously, as if obeying a silent call. The researcher tries to avoid excessive interpretations, but admits, in the margins of his notes, that this is the first clear description of a large group of travelers entering the house on a single night. And of all the names listed between February and March, none, absolutely none, appear in later records of the village, lumber yards, or toll booths. Around 3 in the morning, still according to witnesses, the light in the attic went out abruptly. Not gradually, as would be expected if a lamp went out due to lack of oil, but abruptly, like a sudden cut. Then all the lights in the house went out as well, until only the faint glow of the moon reflected on the snow remained. The silence that followed was never forgotten by the few who were awake. A dense, irregular silence, as if the air had swallowed all sounds. Footsteps, conversations, the creaking of wood, everything. A silence so complete that some residents described feeling a weight, a slight pressure in their ears, as if the night had changed in density. The first suspicions arose only days later, when a cart driver waiting to meet 3 colleagues at a lumber yard realized they had never arrived. Upon returning to North Ashridge, he sought information at the Winterpine's house, but found only Marta, who replied coldly, "They left at dawn." She couldn't say where. She couldn't say when. She offered no details. She just went back inside, closing the wooden door slowly, without haste. For the researcher, this is the decisive point in the narrative, the moment when normality breaks down, albeit silently. It is here that the gaps cease to be the result of geography and begin to suggest something else. The presence of a parallel, hidden movement, too coherent to be mere chance. And all of this gains weight when, leafing through the toll booth notes for the 100th time, he notices a detail that had never caught his attention before. The last recorded entry, the last of the 53 travelers, is dated March 12, 1899. The exit column, like all the others, remains blank, and next to his name, written in the same hurried handwriting that accompanied the other missing persons, is a comment that seems almost irrelevant at first glance. Went up to the attic. Last seen. The researcher ends this excerpt from the reconstruction with a short sentence, quietly noted at the top of the next page, as if he knew that, from then on, the rest of the case could no longer be read in the same way. If the Frost attic held anything, it wasn't just wood or supplies. It was the end of the trail for 53 men. For weeks, the travelers' absence did not cause immediate alarm. Life in North Ashridge continued at its usual pace. Long days of work, cold nights, storms that forced the community to retire early. The disappearance of men in transit at that time rarely caused a stir. It was common for woodcutters to change direction without warning, for peddlers to sell their belongings and board boats bound for the Great Lakes, for messengers to die of pneumonia in distant villages where their names would never be recorded. This was how silence spread across Michigan's northern border, not as shock, but as continuity. What made the absence of the 53 travelers a unique case was not a sudden event, but the insistent sum of small concerns. They arose slowly, like snow accumulating on a windowsill until it finally blocked the view. In early April, a lumberyard supervisor sent a letter to the local reverend asking if 3 workers who had passed through the village were on their way. Days later, a family from Petoskey sought information about a relative who should have arrived at a trading post. None of this sounded alarming in isolation, but when the reverend and 2 residents began comparing dates, routes, and accounts, they realized that all the absences had one thing in common: the Winterpine home. This was the first shock to the community, not because of the suspicion, still in its infancy, but because of the realization that the most disciplined and reserved family in the village now unwittingly occupied the center of a pattern that was difficult to ignore. When the Reverend visited the property to talk to Elias, he noted in his own diary the cold reception he received. There was no invitation to enter, no cordiality. Elias remained at the door, arms crossed, stating that the travelers had moved on. "I don't know where they went," he said simply. "The roads are not our responsibility." The Reverend left with the feeling that he should not insist. However, something caught his attention as he walked away. The attic windows were closed from the inside, even with the unusual heat of that afternoon. The Frost attic seemed not to breathe. There was no sound, no light, no movement, just a dark, motionless volume, as if the upper part of the house had been isolated from the rest of the world. Subsequent reports show growing unease. A cart driver said that as he approached the property days later, he smelled the strong scent of burning wood, but saw no fire burning. A woman said that when she took flour to Marta Winterpine, she was greeted at the door by one of her sons, who looked exhausted and avoided her gaze. Another resident claimed to have seen Elias and his nephew carrying heavy boxes into the barn in the early hours of the morning. Small fragments, small shadows that, when added together, created an atmosphere of silent tension around the house. Even so, no one dared to openly accuse the family. North Ashridge was a place where words carried weight, and unfounded accusations could destroy the delicate harmony of a village that depended on mutual cooperation to survive the long winters. Many chose to remain silent, perhaps hoping that the missing would return, perhaps fearing what they would find if they sought answers deeper. The official investigation only began when a group of workers, pressured by growing fear, demanded that the county sheriff check the Winterpine house. The sheriff, a practical man, not given to theories, gathered 2 deputies and visited the property on a gray morning in late April. The report he produced, however, was surprisingly short and vague. He noted that he had spoken with Elias and that the patriarch had been calm, cooperative, and adamant in his assertion that no travelers remained there after dawn. He also said that the house was in order, that the barn contained only tools and wood, and that the attic appeared to be in common use for storage. However, the sheriff's report omits details that residents claimed to have witnessed. 3 neighbors swore they saw the sheriff and his deputies remain inside the house for over an hour, and that when they left, they were pale and silent, avoiding questions. One of them reported that the sheriff repeatedly wiped his hands on his shirt, as if he were bothered by some residue. Another said that afternoon, he saw one of the deputies sitting on the side of the road, breathing deeply, as if trying to catch his breath after a scare. These inconsistencies led the researcher decades later to conclude that the first official investigation may not have revealed everything it found. This hypothesis is reinforced by the existence of a parallel document, a hastily written note found in the county archives, unsigned, but with handwriting similar to that of one of the sheriff's deputies. The note simply said, "The attic was not empty, but there was no one to question." The enigmatic and dry phrase became central to the later understanding of the case. What did "was not empty" mean? What had been found there? And why was this information not included in the official report? The researcher believes that the answer may lie in another document, an inventory of items seized from the Winterpine property weeks later, when the county finally conducted a more thorough search. The inventory lists common objects, tools, ropes, wooden boxes, lanterns, but highlights a peculiar set, 17 pieces of men's clothing of various sizes, folded and stacked in a corner of the attic. The pieces did not match the size of any of the family members. There were no labels, names, or brands, just men's clothing, clean, stored as if waiting for their owners to return. Next to these items, the inventory mentions a second group of objects. 12 backpacks, all empty, but showing signs of recent use, and among them, a small leather bag containing partially burned papers, toll receipts, shopping lists, letters with no addressee. Everything was incomplete, as if someone had tried to erase the traces, but not enough to reduce everything to ashes. The community reacted to the discovery with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The Winterpine home, once a symbol of discipline and order, now seemed like a space filled with questions. The family, however, remained steadfast. Elias repeated that he did not know where the travelers were. Marta avoided going out. The children worked in silence, and the nephew disappeared from the report soon after. No one could say whether he had run away, left voluntarily, or simply ceased to be seen. The revelation that definitively shook the village came weeks later, when one of the sheriff's deputies, now far from his post, confessed to the Reverend that he had found footprint marks in the attic. Deep, multiple marks, as if dozens of men had been there at some recent point, but there were no signs of a struggle, nor of escape, nor of a fall. Just footprints that ended abruptly in a corner of the wall, as if the trail dissolved into thin air. The Reverend, in recording this account, wrote, "It is as if 53 men had entered the attic, and from there ceased to exist in the plane we know." But the researcher emphasizes, nothing supernatural should be assumed. The story demands human explanations, however painful they may be. And that is where the most disturbing revelation emerges, not an isolated fact, but the final sum of all the clues. On his last official visit to the house, months after the disappearances, the sheriff entered the frost attic alone. When he came down, he was holding a small, hardcover notebook found behind a loose beam. He never disclosed its contents. He simply sealed the notebook and sent it to the county court. The object disappeared from the archives shortly thereafter, leaving only the description of its cover. Simple, dark, with the letter E discreetly marked in the lower corner. The researcher concludes this section with the only remaining note about this notebook, made decades later by a retired court employee who swears he saw the document before it disappeared. It was a list of names, and they all had the same note next to them. They went through the attic. And so, just when the village thought it had gathered all the possible questions, the last known piece of evidence added an even greater doubt. If all those men went to the attic, why was nothing, absolutely nothing, found to indicate where they went afterward? Decades later, when the researcher walked down the road that led to the former Winterpine property, the landscape was no longer the same as the archives described. The pine trees were taller, the barn had collapsed, and the house had been partially overtaken by moss and the cracks of time. The wind, however, remained the same, a cold, continuous wind that seemed to carry untold stories. As he surveyed the grounds, he realized that there were no visible signs that 53 men had once passed through there. Nothing on the ground, nothing on the walls, nothing on the aged wood. Only the air, heavy and silent, seemed to remember. The researcher had devoted much of his life to this case, not out of sensationalist obsession, but because of the insistence with which the dossier returned to his consciousness every winter. The documents, scattered over several decades, had something unfinished about them, as if asking someone to give them form before they were finally forgotten. He knew he would not find complete answers. He knew that many pages had been lost, burned, or intentionally hidden. Still, he could not shake the feeling that the story needed to be retold so that he could finally rest. In the county archives, he revisited the empty columns of the toll exit records countless times. Those gaps, so simple, so straightforward, were like windows open to a silence that no one had dared to fill. There was also the list of clothes found in the attic, folded with a care that did not match haste, neglect, or violence. And above all, there was the missing notebook, whose existence hung over the case like a short but decisive shadow. A list of names according to the retired employee. A list of lives that touched North Ashridge for brief moments, only to cease to exist in the official records. The researcher never claimed to have an explanation. On the contrary, he repeated in lectures and personal notes that the role of a chronicler is not to provide conclusions, but to illuminate the forgotten parts of collective memory. The Winterpine case, according to him, was one of those episodes that refused to fit into a moral narrative or easy logic. It was a fragment of human history in which disappearance took shape not as a spectacle, but as a silent consequence of borders, cold, distances, hard life, and choices. Choices that, seen so late, become impossible to decipher. The village also changed. The church, where so many records were found, fell into ruin. The reverend who had noted the first signs of the pattern was buried without descendants to keep his notebooks, and the neighboring families, whose testimonies helped reconstruct the chronology, dispersed over time. Still, on particularly quiet winter nights, some of the few remaining long-time residents say they can remember the feeling that hung over North Ashridge during the months when it all happened. It was not explicit fear, nor was it overt suspicion. It was something deeper, more instinctive. An understanding that there was an internal order in the Winterpine house that no outsider could comprehend, and that perhaps should never have been investigated so thoroughly. The researcher, sitting once before the abandoned site, wrote a reflection that became the natural conclusion to the entire dossier. He described the house as a body that keeps its own silence, and the attic as an end point that refuses explanation. For him, the 53 men who disappeared were not absorbed by mists or supernatural mysteries, but by the concrete weight of a reality that left no complete witnesses. Whatever happened there, it happened within human limits. Decisions, agreements, secrets, pressures, fears, nothing more than that. And yet, the inexplicable remains. Closing the notebook where he had gathered all the documents, the researcher wrote his final observation, a summary of what, in essence, can be said about the story. Memory does not disappear when the traces vanish. It disappears when no one else tries to understand the silence. And it was this silence that he felt as he got up and walked down the almost erased road that had once led to the Winterpine house. A silence that carried no answers, but also carried no threats. It was just the realization that time had done its work, erased trails, softened pains, collected fears. The frost attic, now just a shadow under the destroyed roof, held nothing but dust and wind. But in the imagination of those who know the story, it remains a final door, a door that closes on 53 names that the world has stopped searching for. As the researcher walked away from the site, he looked one last time at the spot where, according to reports, men had entered in silent file on that night, in March 1899. There were no more marks, no light, no traces, only the fine snow beginning to fall, covering the ground with the same delicacy with which time covers stories that no one dares to touch anymore. He then wrote the sentence that closes the dossier, simple, direct, and profound enough to linger. Some silences do not ask for answers, only that we remember they existed. And so ends the case of the 53 travelers who passed through the frost attic of Winterpine and never returned.